Thank you for joining us this week on Ask a Historian at Heritage Mississauga. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. Each week we invite you to send in your questions and things you're curious about, things you'd like to learn more about. We love hearing from you. We would love to explore the story of this fascinating history of the fascinating city of Mississauga, the history of this place, the people, the buildings, the fun stories, the legends, the myths, all those kinds of things. We'd love to explore with you, and so send your questions in to us, and apart together during these days of COVID, we can sit back and enjoy exploring some of the stories of the city of Mississauga, and really look forward to exploring them with you. So thank you, and look forward to sharing the stories of this place each and every week.
Hi everybody. It's kind of fun to join Matthew Wilkinson today with his Ask a Historian, a question about your hometown. Well, for many years I've always wondered exactly how the business core of Streetsville got started, who owned the first businesses, and where they were located. So Matthew, get out the history books, buddy, because we need a little bit of the history of the business core of Streetsville. Thanks very much.
Hi, Councillor Carlson. Thank you for sending in a question for us here at Ask a Historian, and really good to see you. Glad you're doing well, and someday I'll turn the tables and have you come on and pick your brain on the Streetsville of your youth and the memories that you have and your long family ties to Streetsville. But you're asking really about the core of the village itself, the how that commercial core became established in the village of Streetsville, and there are clues on the landscape, and a lot of them actually have to do with street names. Funnily enough, early street names were often plainly named. Quite often there was a Queen Street or a King Street, depending on the era in which the community was established, who was on the throne itself. And of course, when Streetsville came to be, it was Queen Victoria on the throne after 1837, and Streetsville's history is formation was largely during her reign in the British Empire. So you have Queen Street as well, but really the name Main Street gives you an idea. That's the main thoroughfare in the village, the main east-west thoroughfare that connected to many of the early businesses. And whenever there's a Mill Street in the community, the mills were a lifeblood for early settlement communities, so Mill Street gives you a clue as well. And of course, the other major thoroughfare parallel to Queen was Church Street, and so named because it led to a couple of the early churches. But that's kind of your commercial block, but it's anything around the intersection of your main two roads, the north-south being Queen Street and the east-west being Main, gives you an idea kind of where the focal point of the village would be. It really is what drew people to Streetsville historically. Timothy Street and James Glendinning and others was the availability of water power, and more specifically the ability to harness water power for the operation of mills and industries like tanneries and the like. And Mill Street is what led to Timothy Street's mill complex. So an early derivative of the name Streetsville was Street's Mills, after, of course, Timothy Street. And whenever there's a mill, surrounding farmers who rely on the services provided by mill to harvest their product or to process their product. Well, quite often you couldn't travel to a mill, have your product ground into flour, and then transport back to your farm at the same time. So other industries would follow a mill, and quite often they would be things like a blacksmith, harness maker, a carriage maker, carriage repair, early garage of the day, if you will, inns, places for people to stay, and most specifically that of a general store. A general store where farmers could get the other goods, do their farm shopping, if you will, their family shopping, while their product was being processed in the nearby mill. And so quite often they're all twined together in terms of that early development stage. But the mills are what started. So Timothy Street Street's Mill at the end of Mill Street. But then John Barnhart in 1821, family roots, Barnhart Island near Montreal in the St. Lawrence, came to the Streetsville area and established a general store and referred to it as the Montreal House. And the Montreal House still stands today. It is the oldest commercial building in the city of Mississauga, and it's still operating. Of course, that's just at the intersection of Queen and Main today, but the Montreal House is really that first commercial entity. So called the Montreal House because it identified where the goods came from. That is, that they were coming down the St. Lawrence from kind of that international market through Montreal. So it was a name given for the association as to where the goods were coming from. So really the Montreal House, together with Timothy Street's Mills, are what begin that burgeoning stage, and all the other things follow, other businesses and inns and public houses and things. They all follow in the footsteps of Timothy Street and John Barnhart. Possibly as early as 1825, a little unsure of that. There's a bridge over the Credit River established right at the foot of Main Street and Mill, where they almost intersect, and that was the location of course, Timothy Street's Mill. And so Streetsville, with the crossing of the Credit River, likely the first crossing north of Dundas Street, really becomes a place of prominence in terms of navigating the early landscape. And that brings people, of course, to the mill and to John Barnhart's store and up Main Street right into what would become the village. A number of other things. In 1824, land is set aside by Timothy Street for a cemetery and a Protestant church, a Presbyterian church, and followed soon by a Methodist chapel on Church Street. 1828, a Loyal Orange Lodge is established by, in part due to Commodore Henry Rutledge, which is your ancestor, Councillor Carlson, and also Rutledge donated land for the building of an Anglican church. And so very early on in the mid to late 1820s, you're seeing the beginnings of those communities established. Churches are coming in, a schoolhouse is being built, another general store comes in. The second general store in the community was by Israel Ransom, and this is where the Goodfellas Pizza is today. That's the corner for Israel Ransom's general store. And so you have these early kind of beginnings of the village are really tied to that downtown core, what we recognize as the downtown core of Streetsville today, that intersection again of Main and Queen. By 1835, Streetsville has attracted many more merchants and tradesmen, and the community of Streetsville was really burgeoning and blossoming in population and becoming a real center for the surrounding township. And it drew others. It's kind of when you have, there's a description of the village in 1850 when it had a population of 1,000 people, and it had its own newspaper as of 1843, what would eventually become the Streetsville Review, and it was the first weekly newspaper published between Toronto and Windsor. I mean, Streetsville was on the verge of becoming a much larger population. Again, by 1850, with a population of 1,000, Streetsville was sufficiently established. It had early directories in the 1850s, include mills, tanneries, foundries, a cooperage, a pottery, a brickyard, blacksmiths, shoemakers, carriage shop, tinsmith, a brewery, a telegraph office, physicians, tailors, gunsmith, watchmaker, broom and pail factory, millinery, carpenter, furniture manufactory, stave factory, bobbin factory, 4 churches, an Orange Lodge, and 2 schools. So this is no small community even by 1850. It's really coming to be. Some of those early families are names that recognize down through history today for Streetsville: the Beatties, the Ambletons, the Gradens, the Gooderhams, the Howards, the Hydes, and of course the Street family as well. Some of the early hotels in it, many of which are still standing today: the Globe Hotel, the Tyrone Inn, Franklin House, Pacific Hotel, and the Royal Hotel, all make their ways, amongst many others, within the village itself. By 1843, we have sports being played, organized sports, baseball, hockey, lawn bowling, and cricket clubs are established. An agricultural fair in the 1840s, an established fairground in 1851. The Streetsville Grammar School also opened up in 1851. That's the building that's the Kinsman Hall today, with additions later on in its history. It just, a remarkable story of this evolution of the town itself, and but it really is that intersection, Queen and Main, as it still is today, is the commercial core of the village, the commercial center and hub of the surrounding community, and it's still marked today on one corner by the Montreal House. John Embleton's store still stands, as does Israel Ransom's general store. And so you end up having, they serve different functions over time, but still retain that commercial element and anchoring the landscape. And we look at landmarks that, countless generations have interacted with, and those buildings remain. And that's the key to the community. They have continued to have life. They've continued to have breath in their walls, and really anchor the community that has evolved around them. And it's just such a special place to kind of stand at that intersection of Queen and Main and think of the generations of people that have traverse that landscape and that intersection. You talk about touching history. Timothy Street passed away in the late 1840s, and he would have known that intersection and possibly stood there, or possibly visited the Embleton store, the Mammoth General Store, the Montreal House, and the conversations would have had of wondering what the community would have looked like in time. And yet here we are, flash forward, a couple hundred years later almost, and Streetsville is still a vibrant part of it, a tribute to all those that have come, and the resilient nature of them. There have been challenges in Streetsville too, and I think now the times of COVID and the challenges that presents to commercial entities as they reopen, and Streetsville has had its challenges in the past. It has weathered them, whether it was being bypassed by railways early on in the 1850s, and a loss of population and closures of mills, and floods that have come through the community being so tied to the Credit River, and other epidemics that have swept through, and Streetsville has been resilient through them all. There's a character, there's a story in Streetsville that seems to rebound time and time again, and I think that's something I find encouraging when you look at the story of this place, just the resilient nature, the character of the people there, and almost a defiance of those that call Streetsville home, that they will make it. And there's a strong, historically speaking, a strong work ethic. If you can ascribe an attribute to a town, Streetsville, it has been resilient and very much done things its own way, and I'd like to think that continues within our community today. A lot of colorful stories out of Streetsville, and George, I'm sure you know many of them, and heard of many of them, and perhaps we can touch on some of those in time. But again, it really is that intersection of Queen and Main, and the establishment of John Barnhart's store in 1821, the Montreal House, and of course anchoring the landscape was the foot of Mill Street and Timothy Street's mill. Although gone today, we really do connect to that as kind of the first building block of the community that would become Streetsville. So thank you, Councillor, for the question. Love exploring local history with you anytime, and hopefully we can have you on and gab a little bit about the Streetsville of your memories, and explore some of those. I'm sure I've got loads of questions for you, and look forward to exploring those stories with you. So thank you. Well, thank you for your question on Ask a Historian. You're asking about an old postcard from Port Credit that claims to show or indicates on it Port Credit's oldest inhabitant, and it's dated 1890. What's fascinating is you referencing a postcard that we also have a copy of, and we'll show it here. And the name associated with, in reference to the postcard, is that of the Block family, and specifically Abram Block. And that was what you're asking as well, is what the story of the Block family is. And joining me this week, once again, maybe in homage to Canada Day, but from Ottawa, is Richard Collins. Many of you will remember Richard from a past president, a multi-term past president of the Mississauga South Historical Society, and an interpreter from the Museums of Mississauga, amongst many other endeavors, including walking tours in Old Port Credit Conservation District, and that's ostensibly why I asked Richard to join me, because his knowledge and connections to the early stone hooking families, of which the blocks were one. To get really quick to the point on Abram Block, we don't have a lot of material on the Block family. Certainly we know of them. You can find them in census records. There's a house that still survives, a private home today in the Port Credit Heritage Conservation District at the corner of Front and Lake Streets. There's a house that once belonged to the Block family. But we have one generation of the Blocks being Abram, the patriarch, born in 1808, passing away in 1891 at the age of 83. He had a couple of sons, one named Fred, another one named Abraham. And Abram and Abraham seem to be interchangeable names. And even in one of the records, it appears that the older Abram is actually referenced as Abraham as well. So a little bit of an unknown in that realm. But nonetheless, a well-known character in the community, member of the Methodist Church, chair of a local temperance society. He was part of a prohibition movement in Peel at one point. Just an interesting individual, said to be a really strong man, physically strong. Was involved in stone hooking and boat building along with his partner John Miller. Just an interesting and involved individual within the community. And so Richard, I thought I'd draw you into the conversation today, and I know we got lots of things we can chase and talk about, but the Blocks weren't the only ones involved.
We could go on forever, so
yeah, so
we better pace ourselves.
I'll let you take it away. Take it away, Richard.
Well, as you mentioned, I don't have an awful lot on the Blocks either. I just don't know a lot of it's out there. But we do know the Blocks, along with people like the Blowers and the Hares. They were a stone hooking family. So although Abram wasn't always a stone hooker, because the stone hooking trade in Port Credit didn't last terribly long. Not a lot of shale resources out there to begin with, and once it was gone, it's not like it's a renewable resource. So he tended to be more of a lake boat captain, which means, like people nowadays, if you got a truck, you can hire out some guy who's got a truck to move things for you. And if you were in a port town, you would have a schooner, a boat of some sort. And Abraham Block, the junior Block, did have a ship called the Margaret Ann, and he would simply contract himself out and say, if anyone needs something shipped from Port Credit to Toronto or Toronto to Hamilton or something along the lake, that's what he would do for a living. And if there was no business in contracting out the boat to carry goods, he might engage in fishing, anything that you could do on the water with a schooner. It was just kind of, you did whatever work that you could find related to the lake.
Yeah.
And I think the Blocks were kind of people that just made the best of whatever situation they could get.
And what was the name of the boat again, Richard?
Margaret Ann. At least that comes from Lauren Joyce.
Okay.
So I take that as authoritative.
I was going to say, I would trust that. I trust that source.
I have the whole record. I have on my computer somewhere a list of got to be 70 ships. And there's another one too. The Sarah S or something like that. I don't know if that's the right name. That might have been the older ship. That might have been Abraham, the elder Block's schooner. But again, it wasn't always necessarily engaged in stone hooking, but any way that you could make money from the lake.
I'll try and look up. I have a list of stone hookers and captains. So when we're done talking, I'll see if I can find any imagery or pictures that we might be able to include on.
I'm glad I mentioned that, because I should mention the Joyces were stone hookers and fishers as well. That's another last name in Port Credit.
Well, I was going to say there's a ton of them out there. I mean, the Harrisons. I'm trying to think. The Hares, the Blocks, the
Pickards were there. Nell Anderson claimed to be the last of the fishermen.
Okay.
Even into the 70s, he was still trying to get what fish you could get out. He used to get whitefish in the 30s, but I think that was all gone. But yeah, there's a lot of families and a lot of homes still standing in the Heritage Conservation District. That's that little area south of Lake Shore and west of the Credit River. And a lot of nice old homes there. The Blowers had one. I know the home, one of the few houses that was actually originally registered to a woman, which is very unusual in the 1890s, but 58 Lakeshore. So Lakeshore, about halfway between Peter and Mississauga on the north side, right across from Saddington Park. It was registered to Emily Blower because she lost her husband with 6 kids and she became the captain. She was registered as the captain of the I can't remember the name of their boat right now. And I remember hearing stories of people that would tell that, like a lady, she'd be out there in the water helping to lift the stones, the shale from the ground onto the deck of the ship, but with her bloomers would be floating on the surface of the water because that lady still had to wear their bloomers when they went out. So yeah, interesting stories about the family businesses that stonehooking was at the time.
I'm wondering if Richard, if we could, we didn't prep for this in advance, but it's just occurring to me that we are introducing a trade known as stonehooking, which many have probably heard of in the Port Credit area, but there might be those in our audience that don't know what that means.
That's true. In the rest of Mississauga, yeah. I know in Port Credit, it's required. You have to have an entrance exam to buy a property in Port Credit. You have to know what the stonehookers are, or you don't get in. But yeah, it was a trade that took place in Port Credit, but also Bronte was a big source. Whitby on the other side, Toronto and Hamilton had smaller. But what it was is that Lake Ontario, the bottom of Lake Ontario had a resource called shale or slate, very hard, flat rocks, very sturdy for construction, and they were flat, so they were great for flooring and construction use. I've never been able to confirm it, but I have been told that Ontario's Parliament buildings, Queen's Park, the foundation of Queen's Park is all Port Credit shale. Don't know whether that's true or not, although it certainly makes sense because it's a local resource. And yeah, what they would do is they would pick the shale up off the ground, load it onto the decks of the ships, and then take it usually to markets in Toronto and Hamilton, were the closest place where big buildings were going up. And it was kind of a rogue trade too, because officially when you harvest something, some kind of tonnage that you're going to sell, you have to take it back into harbor and register it, because the excise and custom, the government's got to get their share of what you're going to sell. But very often the stonehookers, once they loaded it and they were already out in the water, it was like, well, without actually going back into harbor to register it, we'll take it to the buyer in Toronto or Hamilton, and no questions asked after that.
Cash on the table.
We never really knew how much tonnage was there, because a lot of it was a business. Because I remember someone asking before how much slate was actually pulled out of the water, and Lauren had responded, we probably will never know, because so little of it was registered as it should have been.
Well, I was going to say, from a landscape perspective, you'd mentioned it earlier, but 58 Lake being right across from Saddington Park, but the creation of Saddington Park in the 1950s as a result largely of a landfill operation was to protect the shoreline, because the shoreline was eroding due to the removal of the shale.
And that first house that you mentioned, a block house that's on the northwest corner of Front and Lake, it's now well inland, but you can see, if you look at the old aerial photographs that you can get on Mississauga, the city of Mississauga's website, the 1954 photo shows that the land was eroding the way where that house was about ready to go, just because the shoreline was eroding. And in fact, once you get out on the front lawn of the house and you're standing on the paved street, even in the 50s, you were standing in Lake Ontario at that point. So that lake, so the blowers at 58, they could have walked out the front door and 50 feet down and they were on the lake. And you don't get that sense now with the Saddington Park. Don't get me wrong, it's a great park, but it has pushed the lake farther away from the community than it was originally.
So in a very strange sense of thought, Saddington Park in a way is the legacy of the blowers and the blocks and the hares and the stonehooking families that plied the waters and proudly made a living off of Lake Ontario and its resources, including the bedrock underneath the shale. But in a way, the park that hundreds and thousands enjoy in a normal course of a year is a result of that time, and the decisions that were made then. And the stonehooking industry is fascinating in the element that
it's unique to only a few places.
Yeah.
You had to have the resource, and you had to have not only the resource to pick it up, but you had to have a place where you could sell it quickly, which means you need big cities like Toronto and Hamilton close by that can make a demand for it. Otherwise, you've got a resource that's way too heavy to carry great distances across the lake, say to get upriver to Montreal or something. It just wouldn't be a viable business. So it was just kind of a perfect storm of having the resource and having the buyers and then having a little community like Port Credit and Bronte that were just in the right place
Yeah.
to take advantage of it. And that's why it's become so much a part of Port Credit lore. But yeah, easily forgotten when you get a little bit further north in Mississauga, where you don't have that immediate connection to the lake. And it kept the town busy for a long time, but again, the resources were very limited. So once they're gone, it's another few 100 million years before you're going to get more of it.
Yeah.
So it's not a viable business.
So is there a hope stonehooking may come back? I said, is there a hope stonehooking may come back?
yeah. Although one thing, probably what ultimately killed it, wasn't even a depletion of resources, but by this time, Portland cement, the process for making it had really reduced the cost of that, and now cement and concrete simply replaced solid stone. That's why you see it in older buildings in Toronto and Hamilton, but you don't see it in newer buildings.
Well, I also remember reading, Lauren Joyce's resources on the late Lauren Joyce's resources on stonehooking. Credit Valley Gateway has a chapter on stonehooking and fishing and what, but the boats were unique, that were purposely built. They had a shallow draft so they get in close to shore. But with the harvesting of stone, they generally worked in shallower water. As the deeper the water get, the sediment was deeper. It was harder to harvest, and so in a way, they maxed out what they could in terms.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's really lots of resources out there, but they were just too deep.
Yeah.
And yeah, you could only be, from what I've been told by Lauren, 6 feet was maybe the max, because you pretty much had to get into the water to lift it up.
Yeah. So
the water couldn't be much deeper than a person, and so also you kind of scoop them up with rakes.
Yeah.
And if you had too much water, if you had 8 or 10 feet of water, you'd end up breaking the rakes. So the technology of the time really didn't allow you to go much more than 6 feet out. And there was a general rule going on, what they called the 3-rod limit, which means within about 20 feet, 3 rods being an old fashioned, for about 20 feet, you weren't allowed to go closer into 20 feet, because that would, if you took the stone out too close to the shoreline, you were inducing potential erosion of the shoreline. So it's kind of an unwritten agreement you couldn't do that. But it must have been awful tempting near the end to take that stuff that was closer to shore. It was easier to get. And you also wanted to have a shallow, you wanted the deck of your boat to be as close to the shoreline as possible, because as you lift out of the water, you don't want to be hoisting another 5 or 6 feet up to get it onto the deck. You want to be able to plop it right on. So you kept your gunnels close to the shoreline, but that meant you could really only go in calm days, because any kind of rough water with a boat with a low deck is going to be deluged with water.
So in a way, when we look at the stone hookers, particularly looking back at that era, this is the blue collar, salt of the earth workers that are delved in this trade. We tend to look at it a little bit more romantically today. This era of the schooners and the stone hookers, but they were the workhorses of their day. This was hard backbreaking labor, literally backbreaking labor, and even the fishery that came along. Some of these boats were converted into fishing schooners and the like. But these old boats were workhorses, and they didn't. There's no stone hookers that are alive that are around today from that era. Certainly, the schooner has made some comeback as a pleasure craft, but from those old workhorses that generations of Port Credit residents and, like you said, Bronte residents and that relied on.
It's interesting to think that these boats were workhorses. Now Port Credit's a much busier harbor now than it's ever been in its life now, but it's a recreation harbor. I imagine things aren't busy this year. So to think of all these ships that were for working class hard work. Now it's people who are pleasure crafts that make Port Credit economy thrive now. That's kind of an interesting thing to note now, that Port Credit's busier now than ever, but it's not a working trade now. And then the fishing industry, of course, salmon too keeps the economy going. A lot of salmon fishing.
Yeah, exactly, and it's the fishery has come kind of in ebbs and flows over time as well. I should apologize to our listeners if there's background information or background noise that you notice on my end. Much like everybody in these interesting times, I'm set up in my kitchen table, but I'm not alone. I've got little ones here as well, and sometimes that provides for some unintentional background.
I've got my window closed. It's damn hot here at the moment because I got construction work going on right outside of.
Oh, lovely.
I can't hear it now. It looks like they've taken a break, so our timing on this was perfect.
But one of the neat things about exploring, I mean, this information was around the postcard from 1890, and thankfully there was a date on the postcard, so we're able to confirm the date of it. And if it does indeed show Abram Bloch, he would have been 82 years old. He passed away in 1891 at the age of 83. He is recorded at least one reference that I found on him as being Port Credit's oldest inhabitant when he passed away in 1891. So there is a connection there. The postcard may well show Abram Bloch. But the fascinating part to me is just the families themselves, not just the Blochs, but all those other families that were interconnected and plied their trade on the water. The water was lifeblood for them, for the community. I mean, outside of the brickyard and the St. Lawrence Starch Company, Port Credit was a harbor town. It relied on. I mean, we can tell stories of bootlegging, which is fun things to explore. We can, explore the wrecks. I mean, I think people are drawn by fascination to underwater archaeology, but Port Credit has its share of wreck stories too. And
the bootlegging was definitely a business at the time because Port Credit had the advantage. It was the one point where the railway tracks and the shoreline were fairly close together. Once you get a little bit close to Oakville and Bronte, the shoreline is moved. The railway tracks are well north. And even once you get into Lakeview and into Mimico, again, the tracks are set further inland. But the advantage of having the railway tracks close to the shoreline and right at the Credit River is that you could take the alcohol off the trains and take them down the hill to the Credit River and then get them down to the shoreline and then get them onto boats and ship them mostly to the U.S. market. And so, again, Port Credit just seemed to have the right geography to be a bootleg place more so than other places along the Lake Ontario shoreline at the time. And another story from Lauren Joyce is that you could manufacture alcohol, you just couldn't sell it. That's what prohibition was. Couldn't sell it, you couldn't purchase it, but you could still make it for export. And so the excuse would be that if you're ever caught with a bunch of booze on your schooner and you were taking it to Rochester, to sell it in the United States, you would have permits claiming that you were shipping the stuff to Saint Pierre and Miquelon, which is two little tiny islands off the coast of Newfoundland, but it was the closest place to Port Credit where there was no prohibition because those two islands were still owned by France. I think they still are. And so that would be excuse. Oh no, we're taking this all the way up to Saint Pierre and Miquelon off the coast of Newfoundland, and we'll be back in a few hours. Of course, clearly they were just going across the lake to Rochester. And
I was going to say those old stone hookers were ocean-worthy, were they?
It really moved too.
But I mean,
bootlegging was a business.
Absolutely, and again, it's people were making a living however they could off the water. And
it was the Depression, and so you look at it with a bit of romanticism. But this is one way that people during the Depression, this is how they earned a living. There was money to be made in it, and it was certainly risky. And it was against the law, but that's what you had to do in the Depression just to survive.
Well, I remember from Lauren Joyce's, speaking of against the law, but from Lauren Joyce's talks in the past, there was a long period of time in this period that Port Credit had about one constable. And they'd whenever they were sending a shipment out, there would be a call to go in that would direct the constable in a different location, and then they'd be able to freely move the goods while the constable was otherwise engaged. It makes you wonder how long that went on. But
Fred Telfer, I believe, was his name. I could have that name on. Telfer seems to come.
Telford. But again, and maybe we can let's not explore this. Let's see if somebody picks up on this and asks a question about it. But
because there are questions about some of the gambling houses. We won't go into detail now. See if someone's interested. I know John Wilson, our former past president of Mississauga South, got involved. It seems like any building that he was innocently doing information on, he would somehow manage to find some connection to a murder or rum running or something. So if you're ever looking for a history on your house, don't ask John because he'll invariably find something nefarious about your property.
He's a good sleuth. He's a good sleuth. But also, I mean, I'd love to explore another time with you is the wreck of the Augusto. We can spend some time on that. And
that's a great story.
There are those stories that we often forget, I think, in the city of Mississauga that we are a port city. We don't view ourselves that way. And our port, as you mentioned, Richard, is very much a recreational port in Port Credit today. But, you know, the lifeblood of that community was the commercial port and the warehouses and the fish huts and all that sort of stuff. And those things are gone today. The river's still there, the port is still there, but it serves a different function today. But
the economy has changed,
very much so. But Mississauga and its identity is very much tied to the water. I mean, we're on the shores of Lake Ontario. We're not an inland city, and we have a long and rich marine history. Lorne Joyce has certainly been we've mentioned his name a few times, but certainly significant in the chronicling of that story. The Mississauga South Historical Society certainly has been helped to foster that memory and keep it alive in terms of the old port days, and yourself as well. I dare say there's not a walking tour that you've done in Port Credit that doesn't touch on stone hooking and the stone hooking families and the buildings they built. But you know, it's a remarkable story, and you know, the postcard.
Even the Aboriginal people, when you think about it, because they settled here because of the Credit River, not so much the shoreline, but the water was the main reason they were here. The Credit River was sacred to them. It was their source of food and travel. So yeah, going back to even before white settlement, what is Mississauga now, fittingly named, goes back to the indigenous people that were here first.
Absolutely. And the rich layers of history. And I mean, the postcard is, to get back to our question and the source of it, the postcard offers a glimpse at a moment in time of an individual, and that individual ties to a much bigger story. And, you know, you walk within the confines or the streets of Old Port Credit Heritage Conservation District today, and you know, many of those streets and many of those houses echo back to that time when Abram Block was alive, and walked those same streets and you know, contemplated.
Both the blocks helped build what is now First United.
Yes.
So yeah, even when you go into that church, I mean, it's modern pews now, but you could imagine, especially in the older section, that's where they were the community leaders that built the Methodist Church at the time. It's United now, but Methodist at the time.
Absolutely, and you know, very, very much part of the lifeblood of this community are the stories of those families. And you know, you can a lot of the Port Credit or the early families of Port Credit, the Stonehookers, there's a fair number buried at Trinity Anglican on Stave Bank, but also over at Spring Creek Cemetery in Clarkson on Clarkson Road. You know, the families are still connected to this place. They left those memories behind, in some cases the pictures behind. There's an old adage that people don't take pictures of things they want to forget. We don't have pictures, very many, of the Block family, but we have a lot of pictures of boats.
And when you do, as you mentioned, when you have pictures of people don't write down the names.
Yes,
because they know who they're taking a picture of. So case in point with this postcard that someone has, and we don't really know who it is, we can make reasonable conjecture given its time that it is Abram Block. But do that now, especially with digital. When people take pictures, it's on their computer and they don't think now's the time to change the file name and put the names of the people in the picture, because you know who they are, but your grandkids won't know who they are, and historians like us in the future. So you're in the habit, everyone, of putting names on the picture in the digital, put them in the file name somewhere.
Well, we'll call that last segment there, Richard. You just said, Richard, we'll say that a historian's lament, if you will, or a historian's lecture of the day is name your pictures, and you know, help us and help those in the future explore and connect to the local history of things that we record. So with that, Richard, thank you once again, joining us from Ottawa, joining us from afar. And on the you know, right around Canada Day. So thank you for that.
It's awful quiet here, so
well,
we'll see
these days.
But I'm glad to be back. I hope to get back soon and do some tours, and I like Mississauga. I still miss it.
We miss you, and so thank you so much, Richard, and we'll talk to you again.
Thanks again.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Just following on our conversation with Richard, and we touched on stone hooking, and wanted to introduce a short music video here and a tribute to the late Leonard Walsh of Port Credit. Leonard wrote a song back in, I believe it was 2006, and he performed it on a couple of locations and a couple of events, including the anniversary celebrations for Port Credit in 2010. The song is simply titled Dundas Shale, and it's a story, a tribute, an ode, if you will, to the stonehookers and the hardworking men and women of Port Credit who plied their craft in the waters around the mouth of the Credit River in Lake Ontario, harvesting the Dundas Shale. That is the shale from the lake bottom, as they would load it onto their boats, backbreaking labor, and sail it into Toronto to sell it as building stone. And so this song, again by the late Leonard Walsh of Port Credit, an ode to the stonehookers, it is known as Dundas Shale. And enjoy. Thank you, Claudia, for your question on Lakeview Beach Public School. Really appreciate you reaching out and going down your own memory of being a young student there at the former Lakeview Beach Public School. And Lakeview Beach is part of historic school section number 7. I'm not sure if that was something you were familiar with or a name that resonated in the 60s or 70s, but school sections were set up throughout the townships and numbered as they were established. And so school section number 7 covered the Lakeview area of what is now Mississauga. The history of the school section traces its roots back to a one-room schoolhouse, a stone schoolhouse, simply known as the Old Stone Schoolhouse at one point, on the south side of Lakeshore Road near Cawthra Road on the Cawthra property. And by 1893, that old stone schoolhouse was overcrowded, and it was determined at the time by the trustees of school section number 7 that one school wasn't going to cut it, and they split the school section into 2, and they created 2 schools, not too far apart from each other, both along Lakeshore Road. The one on the west side was named Lakeview Beach Public School, which is where you attended, and the one on the east side of Lakeview was known as Lakeview Park Public School. So the two public schools, not a long distance apart, but existed simultaneously for a number of years. So back to the story of Lakeview Beach itself. The original Lakeview Beach Public School opened a year later in 1894, but unfortunately it had a fire and it burned to the ground in 1921. For a short time, students were from the Lakeview Beach were sent to attend classes nearby at St. Nicholas's Anglican Church, and also at a hall at the nearby rifle ranges. A new school building was opened on the site in 1923, and you would have known a portion of this building when the time you were there. So from 1923 to 1941, it was a 4-room schoolhouse. By 1941, the school was deemed to be overcrowded again, and some students were sent to Forest Avenue Public School nearby in Port Credit. The Lakeview school section actually leased 3 classroom spaces from Forest Avenue for their students. By 1943, the school was expanded to 9 classrooms with additions to the original building, but it was still not enough, and they continued to lease 3 classrooms from Forest Avenue Public School in Port Credit. Further additions were made to Lakeview Beach Public School in 1956 and 1965, the last one following a fire on the east wing of the building in 1963. We believe, from what we have in the file, you may know this more than we do because you attended the school, but it's this last edition, the 1965 edition, which was known by which students referred to as the Annex, and became part of the expanding and school structure itself. They were located to the rear of the original 1923 school. For the address for the school formerly was 769 Lakeshore Road East, and the old school, Lakeview Beach Public School, continued to serve the community as a school until the end of 1985. And the school was closed, and it was sold. It was converted into an indoor plaza, which did not last very long. And by 1995, the old school school slash plaza was torn down, and an apartment complex now occupies that space in Lakeview. But strong memories around Lakeview Beach Public School, and again, thank you for taking a trip down memory lane. We'd love to see your pictures and perhaps share some of the stories that you have about your school days there, and maybe help us clarify the annex itself, which part of the building that was. We do have some references to a portion being referred to as the annex, but a little unclear which portion of the school it was at this time. So again, thank you for sharing your stories, and look forward to exploring more history with you. Take care. Well, thank you, Janet, for your question for Ask a Historian. And you were asking about the background of the Britannia Schoolhouse, and one that your child had visited a couple of years ago with very fond memories. And so thank you. And rather than try to hobble my way through a response to this, I thought I'd invite Christine Chappell on. And Christine Chappell is an instructor at the Field Centres, but also a schoolmistress at Britannia Schoolhouse. And I'm not sure if your child remembers the schoolmistress at the time, but there's a good chance it might have been Christine. I'm so tickled that he has fond memories of it. My own child also dearly loved the program, and I'm sure countless others across the Peel School Board have had a chance to enjoy themselves at the Britannia Schoolhouse. So thank you for joining us, Christine, and I'm wondering if you can kind of touch on the experience that a student receives at the Britannia Schoolhouse, and we'll jump into the history as well of the center. But again, thank you, Christine, and over to you.
Thanks, Matthew. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the question. And I'm so happy to hear that someone has fond memories of their visit. The idea is that children really experience a day in the life of children long ago. So we try to bring history to life for them, and this ties in perfectly with their curriculum, grade 3, 6, 7, 8, social studies and drama. So that's really very much our focus. And the children come in costume if they can, and part of their pre-visit is putting together a costume using their imagination. They might use an old tea towel for an apron, or pieces of string for suspenders, but we want the children to put themselves in the place of children who came to that school long ago. So do a little pre-work, and then once they get to the schoolhouse, we do some background history and discussion, take them through some of the school routines, and then get acting.
And how many groups? I know we're in non-traditional times right now, but in a regular course of a year, like are you seeing 2 to 3 groups a day, or how does it work with the school? How many groups come through the school?
We can see a maximum of 31 children in the schoolroom a day, because that's the number of desks we have. So that can be one class a day. So we might have a class of 18 children, or often teachers will bring a class and a half from half of another grade 3 class or grade 6 class. So maximum is 31. Okay.
And you see both grade 3 and grade 6 students. Is that the?
And 7 and 8.
Yeah. Oh, and 7 and 8. Okay. So you've got a broad range of people.
And secondary as well.
Oh, wow. Okay. So.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So I think the fabulous thing, and we'll talk about the history of the schoolhouse in a moment, but I think the fabulous thing is, we have a historic schoolhouse that is very active within our community, and I think that's a neat thing. I mean, these one-room schoolhouses, every community or some communities shared a schoolhouse with another community, but almost every community had one, and it's not just Mississauga. This is a rural Ontario structure of a school system, historically speaking. But we have one that survives, and not only does it survive, it's not just the building. It's a functioning schoolhouse. And I know I love walking into the schoolhouse, and I'm sure you do it all often. I don't get to do it very often, but being surrounded by those instruments of education from yesteryear are just, it's a fabulous experience. And what kind of things do the students experience when they come in? I guess I'm focused on the grade 3 connection, but what kind of things do they engage with when they come in? Like, what's a day like for a student?
Well, a grade 3 student would typically come into the schoolhouse, would find a seat in one of the old desks, and then we would take them through the routines of the day, which would include the singing of the national anthem, the health inspection. They would learn the bell drills. We would do typical lessons, arithmetic, spelling, their memory gem. That was very much part of the school system at the time, a lot of memory work.
Okay.
So they would go through those routines, and we would take on the role of a strict school teacher of the time. So there are also punishments. Now, ahead of this, we do quite a workup with the students and have a lot of discussion about what life was like in the past, what was expected of children. We talk about the roles of men and women at the time. We talk about diversity or lack thereof. Right. So their visit to the schoolhouse is not just a day to come and have a fun day, which they do, but the learning involved in it is very significant, and we hope very deep, and is really a springboard for further discussion back at school. Mm. So that's really what we hope they get in their day. And we generally see smiling faces when they go out the door.
Well, I mean, I always say part of my challenge in the day-to-day is, having someone become interested in the community in which they live in. And here you are, you're touching, literally, you're connecting with the youth of the community, and they're coming away with smiles. They're coming away with an interest, with a knowledge of what was, even if it's a cursory, it's a starting point. And this is all part of that culture education, if you will. I don't know what the right word is, but the understanding the context of the place in which you live. And I think, as a landmark in our community, that the schoolhouse is so visible on a very busy thoroughfare here on Ontario Street, and just, to me, an iconic building. And it probably was never viewed as such historically. It was just a schoolhouse in a way. SS number 12 Britannia, number 12, right? Is that SS 12?
That's right. That's right.
So school section 12 in Britannia was not unlike any other schoolhouse, but it survives, and most do not. And not only that, it continues. But,
and the connection to local history, which can then be broadened as well. And with our older students, that's where we delve more deeply into that history. So we do some role play, but then we have inquiry-based programs for the grade 6s and 8s in particular. So they can actually do some in-house inquiry using primary sources that we have and we provide them with, and dig a little deeper into specific things and specific people and do the research.
I think that's fabulous. And so if we can jump, I think the question was asking about the story of the schoolhouse itself, and I know it's a fascinating one with a few different chapters to it. And I mean, you've worked at the schoolhouse now for a number of years. I think, did you say 9 years you worked at the schoolhouse?
9 or so, yes.
9 years, yes. And I'm sure it's gone by like a blink. But
yes.
When you look at the schoolhouse itself, I mean, there's a little bit of ambiguity about the date of construction, even with the schoolhouse. Do you want to dive into that a little bit? And sometimes when we put something on a wall, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always the right. So.
That is true, yes. So it is a designated heritage building. Yeah. But the plaque outside says it was built 1870 something.
Yeah, 76, I believe, yeah.
Yes. But we have evidence that it is 1852 when this red brick schoolhouse was built. And that is the number that we use when that it was built. It replaced a frame school previously.
Right.
And in 1851, I believe there was a report saying that the existing school was in very poor condition and would have to be replaced. So evidence is that in 1852 it was replaced with that little red schoolhouse that's there
I
now.
say I use the 1852 date as well, so it's
There you go. A historian using it makes it official, I think.
Well, we'll work on getting the plaque with the.
Yes.
Now the building. I mean, we're talking a building that served multiple generations of the historic community of Britannia, and the building itself operated as a schoolhouse until, was it 1959, I believe.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
you're dealing with over 100 years of students engaging with that building. So
Yes, and then it was closed for a little over a decade or so in the early 70s.
okay.
A group of students from Streetsville Secondary actually took it on as a project to restore the building, but it had been essentially abandoned for that number of years. And once they really started digging into the project, realized it was just beyond their means.
Right.
And so the Peel Board, who owns the property, and the schoolhouse took it over, renovated it, and it opened in its present state and under this program in 82.
In 82, okay. So so it was closed essentially from 59 to 82, but still part of the school board, and now the school board is continued to operate it since then. And
That's right.
you know, I've got to do a nod of the cap, if you will, to some of the Eva Ardeel for years and years was the schoolmistress there, and Eva, a gem within our community in terms of stories and information and just operating the schoolhouse on a daily basis. But
and still very active with our Friends of the Schoolhouse volunteers.
and that's from a more information perspective, there's the Friends of the Schoolhouse website as well, which we can link to.
Yeah.
But from engaging with the community, I mean, you've taken on you're the school mistress. You have some colleagues that also are participating in the education.
Yes, yes. So students coming to visit the schoolhouse may either see myself or schoolmistress Lisa Cafaro, who is my colleague. And occasionally we do have schoolmasters, Rob Ridley or Mark Hogan, step in as well. So there's always a little variety there.
That's great.
Who's going to be teaching?
And there are periodic in a normal year. There are periodic public days as well. Are there not, in terms of just the general public being able to engage with the schoolhouse?
Yeah, well, every second Sunday of every month we have open Sunday. So
Oh,
the
okay.
schoolhouse at that time between 1 and 4 on that Sunday is open to members of the public.
Yeah.
And it's usually a themed visit. So for instance, March was maple syrup month.
Yeah.
And that's usually our friends, our volunteers who are in the schoolhouse at that time and have the information and welcome visitors to the site. So that's one of them. We don't have as many public programs as were available at one time, but we appear at the Brampton Fair. We were going to be at the Caledon Agricultural Fair this year as well.
Yeah.
But of course that didn't happen. And we have Lemonade on the Lawn in July, usually. So we still have occasional events. And of course, our big Christmas event, our December sale.
No, and you also was I don't know if it still happens or not. I'm remembering a Queen Victoria tea. Is that something that still happens?
Many years ago. No,
Many years,
that was before my time even.
I said I'm dating myself perhaps now. and I know for several years now, and I guess connected in geography in terms of where it's located, Councillor Parrish also does a Ward Fair, a Ward 5 fair each year on the adjacent field and property of the schoolhouse. And I know the schoolhouse is usually open the day of the fair, but you know, the times as they are, it's not quite the normal schedule of things that we normally do, but there are ways to engage, not just from being a student. Of course, that's the intrinsic thing to the schoolhouse itself, but ways to engage within the community with the schoolhouse for anyone who wants to go visit. And I highly recommend it. And it's always fun to sit at those desks, tight little squeeze-in desks that the schoolhouse have, and pretend you're a student from days gone by, and just to immerse yourself in the environment that the schoolhouse provides. And again, it's nostalgic in a way, even for those of us who didn't grow up in a one-room schoolhouse, to envision that world. I mean, many of us have connected to kind of the old style TV shows and movies over the years, and see those things depicted. But knowing that there's living memory that have helped to create the program of the schoolhouse in the remembrance of those times. The late Ben Medill also wrote, forgive me, I don't have the copy of the book, but do you have the book in front of you? There you go. Britannia School and School Farm in My School Days by Ben Medill. Thank you for that. I didn't have that book with me to show, but Ben Medill was a treasure within our community, and we probably don't know as much about the school or the school days in Britannia, or even indeed through historic Mississauga, without the contributions of Ben Medill. And also from the Friends of the Schoolhouse, the tireless work of Joan Reed to craft the book. You look like you're propping up another prop here. There you go, Joan Reed's book, and that's Echoes of the Past. Those books are. Sorry.
I was just going to mention about Echoes of the Past. This was produced using Joan's research, and it was the Friends of the Schoolhouse who used her research and really to pay homage to Joan, who passed away, and to the work that she had done. Her compatriots on the Friends put that together, and it's a fabulous book. So of all the one-room schoolhouses that were in Peel County, and the Friends actually will do speaking engagements as well.
I know they've been out to, I believe, Mississauga South Historical Society in the past, and the books are available through the Friends, are they not? I believe that's,
they are.
Yeah. So,
yes.
And they're treasures to explore within our community, and kind of remember these bygone eras. And I hesitate to use the term bygone, because Britannia is not gone. And it remembers not just the Britannia school days, but indeed arguably all of the one-room schoolhouses that were once part of our community. And it's such a strong connection to our local history. And from one historian to another in our community, and someone who wears a very different hat in terms of a schoolmistress, I thank you. And I was never a good student, and yes, when I went to Britannia, I was punished quite a bit. So I
believe your daughter was as well.
I've heard that. Yes. I remember having to hold out the wood. Just a treasure within our community, and hopefully it continues many more years of active engagement within our community and our school children, because what a fabulous way to connect to the rising generation and pass on the story of local history. So thank you. And
staying current while being in the past.
Absolutely. And that's a continual challenge. History does not stand still, but despite in a way, the resources stand still. And it's
we're learning more, and that's what we're imparting as well.
Yeah, and connecting to the inquiries that come. I mean, we have an inquiry in a format that previously we didn't engage in, and lo and behold, they're remembering fondly the story of the Britannia Schoolhouse. And there's ways in which also, maybe we can close on this, there's ways to engage with the programming, even in these days of COVID and over the summer and
Absolutely.
So on. But you have, what is it you offer online? You have is there a blog you're doing? I can't remember what.
Well, we've been active on social media, the Field Centres, because the schoolhouse is one of the Field Centres of Peel. So I can offer links to those, and our current website as well, and the Britannia email. So if anybody wants to reach out, they're welcome.
And we'll post those links at the end of this program for anyone who's interested. We'll have those available for you, and ways in which we stay connected and hope you can stay connected and explore local history with us. And with that, thank you, Christine. Thank you for exploring the story of Britannia Schoolhouse with me. And thank you, Janet, for your question. I hope that remains a fond memory for your child, and hopefully many, many more children as well. Those that have already experienced it and longing to go back, and those who will experience it in the years ahead. It is, for many of us, for generations, it's been something that we've connected with, and again, hope we continue to connect with. What an amazing institution with some amazing people that help run it. And thank you for your work and the passion you bring to the program, and it's infectious and obviously spills over into the kids. So job well done, and again, hopefully it continues for many, many more years, and just a treasure within our community. So thank you, Christine.
Thanks, Matthew.